Hi, welcome to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. We have a great guest in the studio tonight. My friend Terry Katzman has been involved in various levels of the Twin Cities music scene since the late 1970s. Tonight we're here to talk about a great new project that just came out called Husker Savage Young Do. Recordings, live recordings, unreleased recordings by one of the greatest bands in America, Husker from about 1979 to 1982. Many of the tunes which were recorded by my guest, Terry Katzman. We have a lot to talk about, so we're going to just jump right into it. Terry, welcome to the Wall of Power TV.
Great to be here, Paul. Great to see you.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Husker Savage Young Do.
Well, it's been a developing project really almost since the early 2000s, but since 2007 and 8, those years are when we started to discuss the possibilities of the early tracks that hadn't been released coming out. And so there was there's a give and take and a push and a pull and dealing with legal aspects of the project. Finally, in 2012, Numero got involved by reissuing their first single, Statues, which was sort of the toe in the water to show the band, all their projects are very, very high-end.
Right. Where are they located?
They're in Chicago. They're a Chicago-based label. So that reissue for Record Store Day was sort of the genesis of this coming to fruition. So between 2012 and 13 and 2016, getting the legal issues resolved and all the three of them on the same page. Sometimes the three of them didn't necessarily always get along, but I got along with each one of them.
Right.
So that was if I had any power, that was the power that I had making decisions about or suggestions of what to be used. And so starting early this year is when my archives started. I began submitting them to the label for their auditions and for them to decide which tracks were going to be used.
Now, Terry Katzman, when did you meet the gentlemen in Husker for the first time, and were they calling themselves Husker?
Yes, they were Husker. I met them in the midsummer of '79. They'd been together only about 3 months when I met them.
And tell the people that might not know where the name Husker came from.
Well, it came from a board game. Do You Remember? So I mean, they wanted a name that really didn't. You couldn't say, oh, that's what they sound like, or that's what they are. They wanted kind of a vagueness about what they were going to be called. So that was one of the impetuses.
Is that Norwegian? Swedish. Yes,
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when did you actually start working with them then?
Started working with them. It started pretty much immediately after I met them.
And we were talking about before we started taping tonight about the night you actually met them.
Yeah, I met them, and they were loading into the Longhorn, and I met Grant Hart first, and sat and talked for a while, and then he said, come on inside, I'll introduce you to our guitar player, Bob, and and I can't remember where I met Greg. It must have been shortly thereafter, but I just remember the two of them initially, but it started there, and then I started working with them in their office that they sort of had established, and then started to run sound for them probably in the late fall of all during 1980 is when the ascent started, as far as my involvement, and doing sound for them in the entry. Once they moved over from the Longhorn, that's when I really became involved, because that's when I was a house sound person for Steve McClellan in the 7th Street entry, so I got to work with them and the Replacements and a number of other bands, but my focus was with them.
You wore just about a lot of hats. You were a record label guy, you were a sound guy, a little bit of a manager.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was more of a fan that ended up really working for them. I mean, I wasn't really management material for them.
Right.
And they were, at that point, a do-it-yourself management. They were managing themselves. Later on, when they got David, it was a different story. But at that time period, they were self-managed, and I just sort of was pulled into the tsunami of all of it, just from my fandom of the band, and then
Right.
it sort of just moved on from there. As far
So
as working
was
with
that
them.
night at the Longhorn, was that the very first time you had heard them play?
Yeah. Yep.
What did
on
you
it.
think? What was your feeling?
That they were this funny little pop group that seemed a little bit confrontational, but kind of gentle in a really
Right.
really strange way. I mean, I went on the recommendation of Chris Osgood. He told me to go down and see this band that played Johnny Thunder songs that I'd really like. That's how I end up actually seeing them for the first time.
And Osgood used to, from the Suicide Commandos, of course, the guitar player, didn't he used to give Bob Mould guitar lessons?
Yes, there's
For a while.
there's the story. I think it's been printed before that he had like 2 lessons, and
Right.
then I think Chris said, "I think you've got it now." So, but I mean, yeah, he was a student, definitely a student of Chris's for a very short time. So,
How did you were you actually started to go to rehearsals and setting up the sound for them?
yeah, I mean, it was just sort of a natural development. Once they started to play the entry so often back then, I usually did sound, and that's when the recording commenced, because usually most every time that I would mix for them, I recorded it, except for there was a few exceptions, but by and large, just about every time I mixed, I recorded the show, so they could either hear it back, or if they wanted to critique new tunes, or if they wanted to, they had the flexibility to do that.
Were you wearing earplugs back then? Because
Yeah,
the entry wasn't, it's not, for those of you that have never been there, it's not that big of a room.
No, I had plugs sometimes. Definitely my hearing took a hit from them back then, but usually I would try to protect myself with the frequencies. Mould and I would go over, these frequencies are bad, and
Right.
so you try to, stay away. But I mean, back in those days, the sound system was just barely adequate in
Right.
there for them. So you really had to, and then I was learning by the seat of my pants. I didn't have a guy taking me through all the steps. Maybe I should have now, but I mean, I just...
Oh, you did okay, Katzman.
Yeah, I mean, I just learned, but I mean, that's how I learned. I didn't learn from a textbook. I learned when the PA started feeding back, oh, now what do I do?
Right.
So and learning on that, the entry PA back then was, a fairly crude PA. I mean, the fuses blew every 5 minutes. I mean, especially with them. I mean, driving them, the 2 little Altics that the entry had back then, it was like putting them through a stereo system or
Right.
something, but it worked.
How did you, when you started to feel they started to develop as songwriters, when was the first time you kind of got in tune with that, the artistic development of Husker Du?
Well, from the first songs that I ever heard them play, I mean, Sore Eyes and Writer's Cramp, those songs were, you'd just be naturally hooked if you heard them back then. And so, excuse me, at the times that they were progressing was so fast that, they were dropping songs left and right in favor of ones that might make the record or whatever. So that's kind of what this thing is representing, a lot of the stuff that kind of was dropped or forgotten about or relegated to the tapes and not relegated to any real record at that point, because they had many songs that they only played a very few times that were great songs that most people didn't hear. So
Let's talk about a song that's going to take us to break that you recorded. Was it called Call on Me?
Call on Me is a Mould original, and one of the songs that, if it would have, the record Everything Falls Apart, it was a song that would have ended up on that record, but basically hit the cutting room floor before.
And where is this performance from that we're going to listen
This
to?
performance is from a sound check in the 7th Street entry, not where the door was actually locked. There was nobody in there but the 3 of them and myself. So.
Wow, this is some pretty special private stuff. Terry Katzman talking about the great new release 4-disc set with a book called Savage Young Du, The Beginnings of Husker Du. We're going to listen to a little music and be back with Terry for the whole show on the Wall of Power TV.
There's always something going on at Grumpy's. For happy hour on Monday, it's half-price beer and wine. Killer prices on local taps all day Saturday and bottles of wine at half price every Sunday. At night, the turntables at Grumpy's stay busy with the Minnesota Music Listening Party on Monday and Vino Vinyl on Thursday night. Trailer Park Trivia packs the house on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. And don't miss T-Bone Bingo on Sunday nights. They have it all. Every night of the week, it's Grumpy's Northeast.
Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. My guest in the studio for the whole show tonight, Mr. Terry Katzman. Terry, we were talking about working at 7th Street Entry, mixing sound for Husker. Who else were you hanging out or working with at the time? Because you've worked with a number of bands in town.
Well, yeah, I mean, that coincided with my tenure at Orfolk, which obviously was the punk rock epicenter.
Right, the Mecca.
And so it was just everything coming together sort of at once, the store and then running sound, plus my involvement with Huskers and replacements too to some degree that just it made it pretty special and a kind of a snowballing time because everything was going on at once and you just were sort of part of what was going on and had to just figure out where you were going with it.
Tell the folks out there that might have been too young to actually witness the magic of Orfolk Jokopus. I lived on Ridgewood Avenue behind Rudolph, so I was there 5 times a week. I mean, I've got, I swear to God, 1,500 LPs that I bought at Orfolk that still have the stickers on it, and used CDs. But tell us who else was working there. But let's start with Peter Jesperson, the man I call the Brian Epstein of the Twin Cities.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Truly. I mean, Peter was really the one who hired me in '76 because I was working at another, the first chain. I mean, I've worked in several record stores, but this was the first chain of record stores I worked at called Third Stone Music, and I was working at a location right in Uptown, right where the Taco Bell used to be, and they had a location there, and that's where I was stolen away. Peter actually came in and told my manager, Karen Marks, you know, that we're taking Terry now.
Really?
Yeah, that's sort of, I mean, he has to come to Orfolk, which and after I knew that was the place for me, but it was bittersweet because I had a lot of memories at Third Stone. I mean, that was the first store I ever worked at, and you know, it was your typical '70s waterbed bong.
Yeah.
But I mean, it prepared me to enter the Orfolk world because I had already done retail for a long time, and you know, because by that time I'd already, you know, I've been in record stores since 1970.
And you're still working in a record store.
Still working now at Hi-Fi Records downtown, yep.
Right off Loring Park, John Clifford's Hi-Fi Hair and Sound, with another 2 great music people in town, John Cass, and of course the legendary Steve McClellan.
He is a legend. He's a fantastic guy to work with. I feel lucky I get to work with him again.
Yeah.
You know, I worked with him once when he was my boss at the club, and now I'm working with him again. It's pretty great. So.
Well, you've had, you know, and you're kind of one of the titans of the Twin Cities music scene. And when I say Twin Cities, I primarily mean the Minneapolis music scene, because with the exception of maybe Husker Du coming from St. Paul and occasionally guys like Adam Levy, it was all happening in South Minneapolis, right?
Well, yeah, it was just the focus was Orfolk, obviously, because that's where a lot of the bands that were, a lot of the punk new wave bands were breaking at that store and at other stores like Hot Licks too and Northern Lights. But Orfolk had more of a culture, a little more of a culture surrounding it. Whether it was always positive, I'm not sure about that, but it was an educational atmosphere for music.
And Peter Jesperson, of course, discovered the Replacements and managed them for years, and then with Paul Stark, ran Twin Tone Records. And you know, Bob Stinson, our mutual friend, you had a chance to work with them quite a bit over the years. He had the great line about all the great bands in Minneapolis come between Franklin Avenue and Lake Street and Lyndale and Hennepin. That little golden area, right?
Well, I think it was. Everyone lived there, so
Right.
it wasn't like a coincidence. Everyone, you know.
Rent was cheap.
Yeah, rent
You had
was.
the
you
CC
know,
Club there.
Back when an apartment was $200 or $300 a month.
Right. And four guys could live there.
Yeah, and 4 or 5 people could live there and share the rent. It's not the same now. So
I remember, because I moved to town full-time September of 1978. So I lived on Ridgewood, and when I started to play to make enough money, you know, I was paying $135 a month for my studio, with utilities included.
Yeah,
So
oh,
once
yeah.
I started making a few bucks, my first gig was downtown at Reggie Callahan's club. What am I? Right next to the Skyway Lounge. I was going to say right next to
Yeah.
the Skyway Theater, the Skyway Lounge. So I'd take my $5, I'd go have breakfast, and then I'd stop by Orfolk to buy a record or two for $1.50, you know. But although I didn't necessarily play new wave or punk, you know, I love all kinds of music, but you could just walk in that store and tell there was something going on besides just people buying records.
well, yeah, and they were always, you know, they were always on the cutting edge, really, of music, independent music, if you would call it back then. Because I mean, even before the punk rock thing hit, you know, they had imports. They were one of the few stores that had imports. You know,
Right.
Peter Hamill and Vandergraaf Generator and Chris Spedding and all the other stuff that they had that just a lot of people weren't carrying back then. So they were already positioned for what was going to happen there in '76. And then, of course, once the punk rock thing took off and the Commandos and the Longhorns started going strong, that it changed the whole face of.
Well, too, it was one of the first, I mean, I'm sure record stores over the years have had artists come in and sign records, but that was one of the first places that had in-store performances, correct?
Well, we didn't really have performances, but we were one of the first meet and greet.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, back then we didn't need performances like we did now. It was enough for the bands just to come, but I mean, all the bands that came through, pretty much, just about all of them made a stop
Right.
at the store, you know.
I remember Aztec Camera.
Yeah, Aztec Camera, Johansson,
Yeah.
Violent Femmes, Ramones, Talking Heads 2 times,
Right.
Ramones 2 times too. So I mean, it was just a continual, in those couple of years, it was a continual hotbed of stuff going on, records coming out and bands coming through town. And
Well, I remember going down there and you'd see Bob Mould going through the racks, Chan Pauling going through the racks, Dave Ray going through the
Oh, yeah.
racks buying records. And, you know, some of my fondest memories are seeing a young Tommy Stinson on his lunch break. He had to be, what, 12 years old in 1978?
we have 13, yeah.
Yeah. So who were some of the other guys that were at the store that went on? Now, Jim Peterson was your partner in Garage Door. You opened up that record store on 26th and Nicollet, and from what years to what years?
Well, I was a clerk at Orfolk from '76 until the fire, which was in '85. And after they had the fire there, Jim and I branched out. You know, we'd been there for a while, and we decided that we'd like to try our hand at a new store. So that's how Garage Door. And then we got Paul Stark involved. So it was sort of the three of us that started the Garage Door era. And so that was from '85 until 2001.
More with Terry Katzman on the Wall of Power TV after these messages.
I want you to meet Two Gingers Irish Whiskey. I'm Kieran and I'm Irish, so I tend to like a challenge. Why not? I wanted a whiskey to help find me out what's out there. Like what's really out there. And I found the oldest distillery in Ireland with a water wheel and awards for its small family of whiskies in the middle of Ireland. As I've always seen it, you can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. So try it. The investment is small and the flavor is big. Now, it's perfect for drinking neat, its character holds up, like the Irish, when the bastards try to get you down. Two Gingers Irish whiskey, distilled twice for more character, time for more flavor, and less of the old burn. No lite bastardes carborundum. Don't let the bastards get you down.
Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. My guest in the studio for the whole show tonight, Terry Katzman. We just listened to a track off Savage Young Do, the 69 song compilation, all the early days of Husker Du from 1979 to 1982. Live tracks, unreleased stuff, and cool things. Tell us about the track we just listened to, Terry, Termination.
Oh, Termination is sort of one of Greg's Norton's triumphs, and very much kind of a very dark, heavily influenced by Joy Division type song, but really a great song and one of his great early efforts for sure. So
now, is Greg? There was a gig somewhere, and Greg had a new band. I want to say Porcupines. Or
Porcupine,
something.
yeah, that's
yeah.
Join Porcupine. Yeah, they've done a couple Husker things too. Actually, two of Grant's songs, which they did at this benefit thing for Grant. They did It's Not Funny Anymore and Standing by the Sea, which were, with Greg singing them, it was pretty cool. So
now, I've done a lot of work over the years at Creation Studio with Steve Weiss, and of course that is kind of in its own way kind of ground zero of Minneapolis recording. When you talk about Soma Records, Dave
Everything.
Dudley, the Castaways, the Trashmen,
polka bands,
polka
jazz
bands, yeah.
The longest
Art Blakey, I mean,
longest running recording studio in Minneapolis, right? I
Yeah.
mean, longest because they opened in '53, I think it was, or something. So that's pretty good.
and the building was an old vaudeville movie theater,
Yeah.
in the 20s and 30s. Now, Twin Tone was based out of there for a long time, and so was the Husker Du operation.
Yeah, well, that was during what I call the umbrella period, when Twin Tone was working with a lot of other bands and sort of brought them into this cartel, so to speak,
Right.
because we had Amphetamine Reptile Records run by Tom Hazelmeyer and Red Decibel Records run by Jake Wisely, Willie Wisely's brother, Chris Johnson's label, Big Money, they were in there.
Wow.
Wide Angle Records, which was the dance label that also
Wide Angle,
responsible.
right.
They were
I forgot
next
about
door,
that.
so it was like, well, I think there was like, at one time I think there was about 6 labels plus booking.
Wow.
In there when it was at its peak, I guess.
Talk about, Terry Katzman, from your perspective, starting to see the national recognition via places like the Village Voice, and then just boom, a few years later, you're on the Joan Rivers Show, in USA Today, Rolling Stone. Must have been an incredibly exciting time.
Well, yeah, and you could kind of gauge or measure that period with the start and the end of this collection, because that's sort of when their record Metal Circus came out. I mean, that was sort of Grant's song Diane. Both those songs, I think his songs got the first attention, Diane and It's Not Funny Anymore. And then that was sort of the start, that was the start of them grappling with, well, we're not going to be a hardcore band forever.
Right.
We've got many more things to say. And of course, then next year was Zen Arcade. And then once Zen Arcade came out, then the profile shot to the moon. I was responsible for getting the mail from the P.O. box while they were on tour, and after Zen Arcade came out, you couldn't even get in. One day I couldn't even open the box. I was trying to open the box.
How cool
and
is
all
that?
All the mail just shot out, because sometimes they'd have me, make sure I brought the mail back to the office, open up some mail, make sure there was no checks or, so that was.
Sounds like something on A Hard Day's Night or something.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that's what the time after, when I was working with them in the office and we started Reflex, I was basically just a gopher. If they wanted me to do something, I'd do it. If they needed something sent to them, I'd send it to them. If I needed to go to the bank to make a deposit, I'd do that. Those types of things.
Talk about how hard Bob Mould worked.
His work ethic is, pretty much unparalleled in his his work ethic, I think everybody knows about it from how he plays.
Right.
But it's more importantly, it's his organizational effort. I think that, because even if you take a look in the book here, there's a page that has one of his spreadsheets from the tour with all the numbers. I mean, if somebody bought a candy bar, it got written down. I mean, so this is but I mean, and it is.
Wow.
It is a little bit amusing if you think about it. But,
Right.
But look what that's how you have money.
Right. Yeah.
When you pay attention
Proof's
to those
in the
things.
pudding.
What's that? Pardon me?
The proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, I mean, so he worked hard not on just a musical level and a writing level, but really on all levels.
Right.
He liked to fire 100% on all levels, and he still does today. I mean, that's his
M.O.
Yeah, that's his pedigree.
So get down to Hi-Fi Hair and Sound, get a copy of Husker Du, Savage Young Du. There's a ton of other records down there, including my own. Say hi to Terry once again. What days is that, Terry?
I'm down there Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
Terry Katzman, man, this has been a ball walking back through the time capsule.
Great.
Yeah,
having a great time.
Yeah, that we both lived through. I want to thank you for your friendship and your time being on Wall of Power TV, and we'll see you on down the road.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks for watching Wall of Power TV. This is your host, Paul Metsa.
Someday, the high